I am the correction that is coming for you. And Officer Frazee, that is not a threat. That is a schedule.
The rain came down in sheets across Garrison Street, turning the asphalt into a mirror that reflected the red and blue strobes in long, fractured ribbons of light. And in the center of all of it, pressed face down against the wet hood of a midnight blue 1967 Ford Mustang 390 GT, was a man in a charcoal wool suit that had probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His wrists were wrenched high behind his back at an angle that made two women on the sidewalk physically turn away, and the rain was soaking straight through the wool, through the white dress shirt beneath it, onto skin that was pressed cold against immaculate paint he had spent 30 years keeping perfect. A circle of bystanders had gathered, the way people gather when they sense something is deeply, fundamentally wrong, not just illegal, but morally off-center, in a way that makes the stomach turn, and every single one of them had a phone raised, and not one of them moved to help, because the man doing this to him had a badge pinned to his chest and a hand resting with casual, practiced ease near his holster. The officer's face, visible to the crowd and to every one of those phone cameras, carried a grin that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with power, the particular grin of a man who has never once considered that his actions might have consequences. He didn't know who he was holding down against that hood. He didn't know that the man whose shoulder he was grinding into the paint had spent the last 2 decades shaping the interpretation of law in this state or that. By the time this rain stopped falling, one of them was going to lose absolutely everything. And it was not going to be the man in handcuffs. 40 minutes earlier, Marcus Webb had been completely, genuinely happy, which was not a state he took for granted anymore. He was 61 years old, and he drove the Mustang the way he had driven it since he was 32. Windows down when the weather allowed jazz station playing low on the dash. Both hands on the wheel because the car demanded respect, and he had always believed that things which deserved respect should receive it. And tonight, the weather did not allow the windows down. So the rain drummed a soft rhythm against the roof, and the heater pushed warm air through the vents, and the whole interior smelled of old leather and the faint cedar of the air freshener Valerie had hung on his mirror last Christmas, which he kept because she had picked it out herself. He was heading to Patrice's Fine Bakery on Garrison Street, which was the kind of neighborhood where the lawns looked like they were maintained by people who had studied horticulture specifically for this purpose, and where the silence between the houses was the expensive kind, the kind that costs money to maintain. Marcus did not live in Kensington Heights, and he had never particularly wanted to, but Patrice's made a raspberry tart with a specific combination of cream and almond flour that his daughter Valerie had been obsessed with since she was 3 years old, and today was Valerie's 30th birthday, which meant he was going to buy every single one they had left on the shelf. In the passenger seat sat a small velvet box, a diamond pendant that had belonged to his mother, and before her to his grandmother, that he had just picked up from the jeweler on 5th after leaving the courthouse for the last time that week. He was by any measure available to him in that moment, a man at peace. He pulled the Mustang to the curb in front of the bakery, cut the engine, listened to the rain for exactly 3 seconds, the way he always did, and stepped out. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a charcoal coat moving with the deliberate ease of someone who had long since stopped needing to rush, and as he locked the door, he noticed the patrol cruiser slow as it passed him on the street. Old habit made him nod. The cruiser did not nod back. It stopped. Cody Briggs had been explaining the world to Tyler Marsh for the entire shift, which was something Marsh had come to understand was simply part of working with Briggs. You didn't get a partner, you got a lecturer who happened to also drive the car. Tonight's lecture had started 3 blocks back when Briggs spotted the Mustang pulled to the curb on Garrison Street, and it went like this. Certain people in certain neighborhoods were always there for a reason, and the reason was almost never the obvious one. And a good officer didn't wait for something to happen before asking the question, because by the time something happened, it was already too late. And that was the difference between a cop who made arrests and a cop who prevented crimes, and Briggs considered himself very much the second kind. Marsh, who was 24 years old and had been on the force for 7 months, said carefully that the car looked registered, and the man standing next to it looked calm, and Briggs turned to look at Marsh with the particular expression he reserved for statements he found both wrong and slightly offensive. "Calm is a choice," Briggs said. "Calm is what you do when you've done this before and you know how to handle the attention. You see a nervous guy, you've got a nervous guy. You see a calm guy in a neighborhood he doesn't belong in standing next to a car like that, that's something else entirely." He was already pulling the cruiser to the curb before Marsh could find a response. Briggs was 36 years old, broad-necked with a jawline that seemed permanently set in a position of mild challenge, and he wore his badge the way some men wore a signet ring, not as an identification, but as an announcement. And he stepped out of the cruiser with his chest slightly forward and his right hand resting near his holster in a gesture so practiced it had long since ceased to be conscious. The conversation on the sidewalk moved in 3 distinct beats, each one tighter than the last. First, Briggs questioned Marcus's reason for being in the Heights, not directly because Briggs was experienced enough to know how to code it, but clearly enough that every bystander within earshot understood exactly what was being said. And Marcus answered with a calm so complete and so unperturbed that it visibly irritated Briggs in the way that composure always irritated him in people he had already decided were guilty of something. Second, Marcus stated clearly that his identification was inside the vehicle and he was happy to retrieve it. And Briggs read this reasonable, lawful statement as defiance, because in Briggs's understanding of the world, a person who did not immediately become afraid of him was a person hiding something. Third, Briggs shoved Marcus onto the hood of the Mustang and open palm strike between the shoulder blades, and the sound of a man's chest hitting metal carried halfway down the block, and the collective intake of breath from the bakery patrons was audible, even over the rain. Marcus did not resist. He went completely, deliberately limp, not because he was weak, but because he understood something Briggs would never understand, that the street was not the arena, and everything that happened on it was evidence, and evidence required a witness, and right now he had about 40 of them with phones in their hands. Briggs leaned down and whispered something into Marcus's ear, his lips close enough that the cameras wouldn't catch the words. Marcus's jaw tightened, one muscle, one movement, and then his face went perfectly deliberately still. Marsh ran the plates from the passenger seat, and his voice, when he reported back, had the careful, deliberate flatness of a man trying very hard not to convey the alarm he was feeling. "Clean registration," he said. "Vehicle comes back to a Marcus Webb, no warrants, no priors, clean record going back as far as the system showed." Briggs didn't pause. He didn't hesitate. He announced loudly enough for the crowd to hear that the plates may have been transferred from a similar vehicle, a technique he explained to no one who had asked, and reached for his cuffs. This was the moment, though, Marsh would not be able to articulate it until much later, when what was happening crossed from misconduct into something else entirely, something with a different name and a different set of federal statutes attached to it. Marsh took a half step back from the scene. Not away, not far enough to mean anything to Briggs, but back a small physical separation, as though some part of him was already trying to establish a boundary between himself and what was unfolding. And then he stood very still and watched Briggs cuff Marcus Webb's wrists behind his back, and Marsh's right hand, which had started to come up for the high five, Briggs offered a moment later, stopped at waist level and came back down. Briggs did not notice. The interior of the cruiser smelled of chemical cleaner, and something older underneath it, the particular staleness of a space that had held frightened people for years, and the plastic seat in the back was hard and cold and slightly sticky, in the way institutional surfaces always were. And Marcus sat in it with his legs angled uncomfortably to one side and his hands behind him and his back perfectly straight, because a man's posture was the one thing no one could take from him on a street or anywhere else. He began to catalog. No articulable suspicion stated before the stop. No probable cause announced before the vehicle contact. No Miranda rights read at any point. Force applied prior to any resistance or threat. False charge announced identity fraud before identification was even examined. And now transportation to booking on charges that had no foundation in anything that had occurred on that sidewalk. He noted each item the way a surgeon notes instruments before an operation, not with emotion but with the precise, unhurried attention of someone who understands that accuracy in this moment is the only thing that will matter later. In the front seat, Briggs was talking, his voice carrying the particular energy of a man replaying something he is proud of, constructing the narrative as he drove. Smooth-talking grifter, he said. Probably a money man. For someone. Maybe cartel adjacent. You could always tell by the car, by the way they dressed, by the way they looked at you like you were the one who had done something wrong. Marsh stared out the passenger window at the rain-slicked street and said nothing. And Marcus in the back seat pressed the face of his watch quietly against the cage mesh between them and tilted it toward the overhead light. The engraving on the back read M. Webb State Supreme Court appointed, and he looked at it for exactly 1 second, then straightened his back and waited. The Oak Falls PD booking area at 9:30 on a Friday evening was the specific kind of controlled chaos that smelled like burnt coffee and industrial floor cleaner, and the particular brand of exhaustion that settled into a room when everyone in it had been awake too long and seen too much, and Sergeant Frank Okafor sat behind the desk at the center of all of it, with his coffee going cold beside him and a stack of Friday's paperwork that had somehow become Saturday morning's problem. He looked up when Briggs came through the door. He set down his coffee. He looked at the man Briggs was steering through the booking area by the elbow, the charcoal coat, the expensive watch, the posture that had not broken despite the wet hair and the red marks already forming at the wrists. And something in Okafor's expression went very quiet and very still in the way that faces go when a person is rapidly running calculations that they know are going to end badly for someone. Briggs announced the charges loudly, with the particular performance of a man who wants the room to be watching grand theft auto identity fraud resisting arrest. He said the name Marcus Webb, the way you say a name you don't recognize flatly as a placeholder. Okafor said, "What's the name on the ID, Briggs?" The room, which had been producing the usual background noise of a Friday booking area, went quiet by about 80%, and a detective in the corner stopped typing mid-sentence and did not resume. Okafor walked around the desk slowly, the way a man walks when he is deciding how much of what he is feeling to show, and he stood in front of Marcus Webb and looked at him directly. Not at the charges, not at Briggs, at the man. Because Okafor had testified before Marcus Webb's court 11 times in his career, had watched him dismantle false prosecutions with the quiet, surgical precision of a man who had been doing this long enough to know exactly where the rot was, and he was looking at him now, and he was recognizing him, and the muscle in his own jaw was doing something it took considerable effort to control. He told Briggs to remove the handcuffs. He said it once, quietly. Briggs started a new theory, the plates, the timing, the profile, and Okafor said 3 words that were not loud but that carried the specific weight of a man who was done, and Briggs stopped talking. The cuffs came off. Marcus straightened his coat, one motion precise and unhurried, and then he turned and looked at Briggs, and it was the first time since the sidewalk that he had looked at him directly without the hood of the car between them. And what Briggs saw in that look was not anger, which he could have handled, but something far more unsettling. The focused, patient attention of a man who has already begun. "You asked me what I was," Marcus said, his voice low and even, and carrying no more emotion than a man reading a legal brief. "I am the correction that is coming for you. And officer, that is not a threat. That is a schedule." He walked past Okafor toward the glass-walled office, and every officer in the booking area watched him go, and then in the particular silence that followed turned to look at Briggs. The locker room was of the kind of quiet that happens when sound has not left a space, but has simply decided to hold its breath, and Briggs sat on the bench in front of his locker with his hands resting on his knees and his hands visibly trembling, which he was aware of and could not stop. He told Marsh they needed to get their account straight. "Not lie," he said, using the word carefully. "Just tell it consistently," and he laid out the version. The car was suspicious. The subject was aggressive. The identification looked irregular. Force was applied only after non-compliance. The charge of identity fraud was a precautionary measure pending verification, and if Marsh wrote it up exactly that way and held to it, the union would stand behind both of them, and qualified immunity was not a technicality. It was a constitutional protection that existed for exactly this kind of situation. Marsh was sitting on the bench across from him, still in his uniform, holding one boot, and he did not write anything down, and he did not look up. Garrett Marsh said after a long moment. I watched the sergeant's face when he recognized him. I've been on the job 7 months, and I have never seen a senior officer look like that. Before Briggs could respond, Officer Dennis Collier from Cybercrimes came through the door at a pace that was slightly too fast to be casual, holding a tablet with the particular energy of a man delivering news he does not want to be the one delivering. The video had been posted 40 minutes ago by an account called at Garrison Watchdog, and it was trending nationally, and it was high definition, and it was everything. The sidewalk, the shove, the crowd's sharp intake of breath, the audio of Marcus's voice stating calmly that he was a justice of the state Supreme Court. And then the bystander's camera had zoomed slowly and with devastating clarity onto Briggs's face. At the moment, he leaned down to whisper, and the expression captured there was the expression of a man who believed with complete certainty that he would never be seen doing what he was doing. A second clip filmed inside the booking area on a smuggled phone showed Okafor's face and Marcus adjusting his coat and the specific quality of the silence in the room after Marcus spoke. The comment section had already found Briggs's Facebook account and the 4-year-old post in which he had written with remarkable candor for a public platform that certain neighborhoods needed to maintain their character or they stopped being worth protecting. Briggs dropped the tablet onto the bench beside him. He looked at the other officers in the room, and for the first time in his career, not a single one of them looked back. The brownstone on Alderman Street smelled like the dinner that had gone cold 2 hours ago. Roasted chicken and something with garlic that Valerie had made before she saw the news, before she started calling his phone every 4 minutes until he finally answered from Okafor's office, and Marcus sat in his leather armchair with an ice pack pressed to his left shoulder where the old tennis injury had announced itself again loudly during the hood of the car portion of the evening. Valerie sat on the ottoman at his feet, cleaning the dark red welt on his wrist with antiseptic and not bothering to hide the fact that she was crying because Valerie had always cried the way she did everything else, directly, without apology, and with full commitment. He told her it was just a bruise, and she told him she had watched the video, and the way she said it made it clear that just a bruise was not a framework she was willing to accept for what she had seen. He put his good hand on her hair, and he said, if he had done this to a boy from the East Side, someone 22 years old, first job driving his cousin's car, it would have been that boy's word against a decorated officer's report. And the report would have said, suspect resisted. And that would have been the last anyone heard of it. I have a voice. A lot of people who get treated exactly the way I was treated tonight do not. That is why this is going to matter. Valerie looked up at him, and she didn't say anything for a moment, and then the doorbell rang, aggressive, impatient, and Marcus signaled her to stay. Chief Raymond Stalls and Mayor Patricia Hensley stood on the porch in the rain with the practiced, careful expressions of people arriving at a scene they had caused and hoped to manage, and Marcus let them in without warmth and led them to the study and did not offer them a seat. The city's offer was comprehensive paid administrative leave for Briggs, a formal public apology, and a financial settlement figure that the mayor delivered in the careful tone of someone who had rehearsed it, the kind of number designed to feel significant without actually being accountability. Marcus asked for Briggs's real personnel file, not the press version, not the union-reviewed summary, the actual disciplinary record with every complaint logged and every disposition noted. Stalls said that was confidential personnel information and would require a subpoena. Marcus said that was fine. He would get one, and also he would be filing a civil rights complaint with the Department of Justice, and the city should be aware that his attorney had a very specific approach to these matters. You want to avoid a spectacle, Marcus said, walking to the front door and holding it open. You should have hired differently. After the door closed, he stood in the hallway for a moment, ice pack in hand, and then he went to his desk and picked up his phone and dialed a number he had not dialed in 3 years. When the line connected, he said, "Dominic, it's Marcus Webb. I need the kind of attorney who makes institutions afraid of paperwork. I hear that's still you." Dominic Voss's office on the 14th floor of the Carver building looked at first glance like the office of a man who had too much to do and not enough wall space to track all of it. And at second glance, like the office of a man who had exactly enough wall space and had filled every inch of it with purpose. Names connected by red thread dates in columns, photographs and depositions, and financial records arranged in a pattern that suggested someone had been thinking about the relationship between power and accountability for a very long time, and had developed specific practical opinions about how to exploit the gaps between them. Voss himself was 53, compact with close-cropped silver hair and the unhurried manner of a man who had learned that urgency was something other people felt when they hadn't prepared properly. And his first words to Marcus, after Marcus finished describing the evening, were not an expression of outrage or sympathy, but a single specific question about the badge number. He already had a whiteboard up before Marcus reached the part about the booking room. He laid out the strategy in plain language. Because Voss had a professional contempt for jargon in private settings, they would sue Briggs personally, not just the city, which was unusual, which was difficult, which was exactly the point, because piercing qualified immunity required establishing that Briggs had violated rights, so clearly established that no reasonable officer could have believed his conduct was lawful. And based on what Marcus had just described, Voss felt very comfortable with that standard. Marcus mentioned quietly that there had been a call to his cell that morning from a number he didn't recognize, a voice that identified itself only as someone inside the department who had watched what happened in the booking room and wanted Marcus to know that what Briggs had done on that sidewalk was not the first time, and that there was a file, a real one, and it was not the file the city was going to hand over voluntarily. Voss looked at him for a moment. "Is it Marsh?" he asked. Marcus said he didn't know yet. Voss uncapped a marker and wrote Tyler Marsh's name on the whiteboard with the decisive certainty of a man writing down something he already intends to use. The steps of the Whitmore County Courthouse were the kind of public surface that had absorbed a great deal of history, and on a Tuesday morning with 37 media outlets represented and a crowd that had gathered, not because anyone had organized it, but because the video had been shared 6 million times. Marcus Webb stood beside Dominic Voss in a three-piece navy suit and spoke without notes because he had never needed notes for anything he actually knew. He did not read from a prepared statement. He spoke from memory, which was more devastating because it meant there was no paper to hide behind and no disclaimer about pending verification, just a man standing in the rain-damp morning air, speaking facts in the particular cadence of someone who had spent decades in rooms where facts were the only currency that mattered. He named each complaint in Briggs's record by date and disposition. Excessive force applied to a 17-year-old during a parking dispute complaint dismissed after union review. Racial bias alleged during a traffic stop on the East Corridor, complaint dismissed, officer counseled but not documented. A police report filed by Briggs that forensic review later identified as containing material inaccuracies, the department's language, not his, resulting in a one-day suspension with pay. The crowd was very quiet during this portion. The reporters were typing with both hands. The city knew, Marcus said, and his voice did not rise, which somehow made the statement louder. The chief knew. They reviewed these complaints. They reviewed this officer and they made a decision. They gave him a badge and a gun and the full authority of the department, and they put him back on the street in a city he was demonstrably not safe for the public to be around. I was not an unlucky accident. I was an inevitable outcome of a set of decisions that were made deliberately over years by people who believed the consequences would land on someone without the resources to push back. He paused and looked at the cameras and said one more thing about the courage it took to be the only person in a room who had decided to tell the truth when everyone around them had decided not to, and he did not name Marsh, but the sentence was shaped like a door left slightly open. In his living room, Briggs watched the press conference with the television volume too low and the blinds tilted nearly shut. and when Marcus finished speaking, Briggs's hand was pressed flat against his chest as though checking whether his heart was still making the effort, and the answer physically was yes, but everything else felt considerably less certain. Tyler Marsh had not slept, which was evident in a way that sleep deprivation always is, not just in the eyes, but in the specific quality of stillness a person achieves when they have been sitting in the same position, thinking the same thoughts for long enough that movement has started to feel like a commitment they aren't ready to make. He was parked in the lot outside the Oak Falls PD at 6:14 in the morning with the engine running and both hands on the wheel and no particular intention of going inside, and he had been there for 40 minutes, and he was thinking about the camera. Briggs had taken it in the server room standard procedure. He had said senior officer handles the upload, and Marsh had watched him go in, and Briggs had been in there for a long time, long enough that Marsh had found himself standing in the hallway outside the glass partition, watching through the glass without quite deciding to, and he had seen Briggs at the terminal, and he had seen Chief Stalls standing behind Briggs's shoulder, watching the screen, and both of them had been laughing in the particular way that people laugh when they believe they are getting away with something. When Briggs came out, he handed Marsh his camera back and said the system had experienced a glitch and the footage was unrecoverable, and Marsh should note in his report that the battery had malfunctioned during the arrest, and Marsh had taken the camera and said, "Okay," and that was all he had said. But before he had handed the camera to Briggs in the first place, before any of that, Marsh had done something that his academy instructor had called a basic professional habit and that Briggs had called paranoid. He had transferred the footage to an encrypted personal backup drive, a small device he kept in his kit bag because he had been taught that cameras failed and servers crashed and evidence was fragile, and a good officer protected the record. He drove to Dominic Voss's office on the 14th floor of the Carver building, and he did not call ahead, and when the receptionist said Mr. Voss was with a client, Marsh said he knew, and he waited. When Voss brought him into the conference room, Marcus Webb was already there, and Marsh had not expected that, and for a moment he simply stood in the doorway with the small encrypted drive in his hand and did not speak. He asked one question: will this actually change anything? Not for him, I know what it does for him. For the next person, for the person after that. Does it actually change anything? Marcus looked at him for a long moment, and then he said, "Not by itself, but without it, nothing else can." Marsh crossed the room and set the drive on the table. The breaking news banner appeared at 11:40 that morning. Sources inside the Oak Falls Police Department had confirmed that the body camera footage from Officer Briggs's unit was corrupted and unrecoverable, and the dash camera from the patrol cruiser had experienced a mechanical failure during the window of the arrest, and the department was cooperating fully with internal review processes. Voss slammed both palms on the conference table when the alert came through on his phone, which was the most physically expressive thing Marcus had seen him do. And then Voss looked at Marcus, and Marcus was not slamming anything, was not raising his voice, was not moving at all. He had gone to the particular quality of stillness that Voss recognized because he had seen it in Marcus's courtroom before, the stillness that happened just before something decisive. The stillness of a man who had just been handed exactly what he needed. "They didn't just destroy evidence," Marcus said, in a voice so quiet that Voss leaned forward slightly to hear it clearly. "They just told us exactly how afraid they are." Marsh's drive contained his own camera's original footage transferred before Briggs ever touched it. The full stop, the sidewalk, the whisper, the shove, the booking room. Okafor's face. Marcus adjusting his coat every second of it in high definition and unaltered, and FBI forensics working on the server hardware itself found something neither Briggs nor Stalls had known existed. The server tower had an internal microphone, a manufacturer's failsafe for remote diagnostics, and it had been active during the deletion. And it had captured audio of Chief Stalls' voice, directing the process with a specificity that removed any possible interpretation of coincidence. "Make him look like an aggressor in the report," Stalls' voice said, captured in the ambient audio of a room where two men believed they were invisible. "We bury him in paperwork until he takes a settlement and goes away." Who's going to believe a man from the east side over a decorated officer? Marcus told Voss to amend the filing. Voss said, to what Marcus said, Rico. We're not going after one bad officer and a chief who helped him cover it up. We're going after a department that has operated as a coordinated self-protective criminal enterprise for years. We go after the institution. Voss was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Harlan, that is either the bravest legal filing I have ever been part of, or the most expensive one. Marcus said, write it up. The deposition room on the third floor of Voss's firm was a low-ceilinged rectangle with one window that looked out onto the parking structure across the alley, and the Venetian blinds on that window were tilted at an angle that sent bar-shaped shadows across the conference table in the early afternoon light. And the court reporter's machine made a sound like very small, very insistent rain, and Tyler Marsh sat across the mahogany table from Dominic Voss and looked like a young man who had not eaten a full meal in several days. He was in plain clothes, dark jeans, a gray sweater, and without the uniform, he looked younger than 24, which was disorienting in a way Marcus had not entirely anticipated, because it was easier to think about what Marsh had and hadn't done when he was wearing the badge, and without it, he just looked like someone's son. The union attorney seated beside Marsh was a man named Gerald Pruitt, who had the practiced rhythm of someone who interrupted for a living, and he interrupted 3 times in the first 5 minutes, before Voss looked at him with an expression that communicated with great efficiency that the next interruption would be treated as an indication that Pruitt wanted to explain his conduct to a federal judge, and after that, Pruitt largely confined himself to writing on his notepad. Voss built the question slowly and in sequence, the way a person builds something load-bearing, each piece placed precisely before the next was added. And the central question when it arrived was simple: had Marsh turned off his own camera? Marsh said no. He said it clearly and without hesitation, and then he described what had happened in the server room. Briggs taking the camera. The long wait in the hallway looking through the glass partition. Seeing Stalls standing behind Briggs at the terminal, and the laughter which Marsh described in the same specific way he had described it to Marcus earlier, with the word laughing sitting in the deposition record like something that could not be walked back. Voss said, "And when Briggs handed you back your camera, what did he tell you?" Marsh said. "He said, glitch in the system, kid. Happens all the time. And then he told me to write in my report that the battery had died during the arrest. And did you write that?" Marsh looked at the table. Yes. Then he looked up and across the table. Marcus was watching him, not with anger, not with judgment, with the particular patient attention of a man who understood that the person across from him was trying to do something difficult and was going to need a moment to finish doing it. And Marsh said quietly that he had been afraid, and that Briggs had made it clear that the union's support was conditional on loyalty, and that Blue Bleeds for Blue was not just a phrase, it was a policy, and he had been 23 years old and 7 months into a career he had wanted since he was 14, and he had not known what else to do. Marcus leaned forward and asked 4 words. "What do you know?" And what Marsh knew, the full account, every shakedown he had witnessed, every report he had watched Briggs alter the 2 other stops in the previous 6 months that had followed the same pattern as Marcus's arrest, took 45 minutes to get onto the record, and by the end of it, Pruitt had stopped writing entirely and was staring at the wall. Voss closed his folder and said, "Thank you, Officer Marsh. You just did the hardest thing you're ever going to do in this profession, and I want you to know that it matters." The deposition transcript had not been formally released when it began to move through the courthouse, not through Voss's office, not through Marcus, but through a junior records clerk named Donna, who had been with the court for 19 years and who read the first 4 pages during her lunch break, and then made a call she would later describe as the easiest decision of her career. And by 3 in the afternoon, it was in the hands of 2 major news networks and trending on every platform that existed for the specific purpose of absorbing information faster than institutions could contain it. Chief Stahl stopped taking calls at 2:45 and was not seen leaving his office for the remainder of the business day, and his administrative assistant submitted her resignation by email at 4 o'clock with a courtesy copy to the city's HR department and no explanation. Mayor Hensley held a press conference at 5 in which she called for an independent investigation by the State Attorney General's office and used the phrase "I share the community's deep concern" 4 times in 11 minutes, which was the political equivalent of a person climbing into a lifeboat and pushing off from the ship with both feet before anyone else could follow. The union representative, a man named Dale Fettig, who had built a 20-year career on the premise that the blue wall was load-bearing, called Briggs at 5:20, and the conversation lasted 4 minutes, and the specific sentence that ended it was Fettig saying in a voice completely drained of the protective warmth it had carried a week earlier that the union's obligation extended to workplace disciplinary matters and not to personal civil liability, and that Briggs should contact a private attorney at his earliest convenience, and that Fettig wished him the best. Briggs sat in his kitchen after that call for a long time, and the kitchen was ordinary in the specific way that made its ordinariness unbearable. The coffee maker he'd bought 2 Christmases ago, the truck key hanging by the door, the framed photo of his academy graduation on the wall, and he understood looking at these things that they were not permanent, that the judgment in the civil case was going to move through these rooms like water and take everything with it, and that there was no one left who was going to help him stop it. The knock at the door came at 6:42. He looked through the peephole and saw the black SUV with federal plates in his driveway and 2 agents in dark windbreakers on his porch, and behind them the street he had patrolled for 9 years, and he stood there for a long moment just breathing. He opened the door, and the agent on the left held up a badge and said his name and read the charges: deprivation of rights under color of law conspiracy to obstruct justice tampering with evidence, and then said that his rookie partner had submitted the original hard drive backup to the FBI field office that morning, and that the footage was intact, and that it was very complete. Briggs said he was just he didn't look like, and stopped, because he understood in the middle of that sentence that there was no version of it that ended anywhere useful. The agent said, "Turn around, Mr. Briggs." The handcuffs closed around his wrists, and they were cold, and they were tight, and they were in every way that mattered permanent. The trial was moved to the state capitol because finding 12 people in Oak Falls who had not seen the video was a project that the court declined to undertake, and the courtroom in the Whitmore State Judicial Center was a high-ceilinged room that smelled of polished wood, and the particular institutional coldness of air conditioning set 3 degrees lower than comfort, and the gallery was packed to the last seat on the first morning and stayed that way for 11 days. Marcus Webb sat in the front row, not behind the bench. Private citizen father, a black man who had decided that the most powerful thing he could do was be present in this room without the insulation of institutional authority, just himself watching the machinery he had spent his career operating from the other side finally turn its attention toward accountability. The prosecution played the recovered footage on a screen that occupied most of the front wall of the courtroom, and the room watched in the kind of silence that is not comfortable but is necessary. The silence of people being asked to see something clearly. 3 moments from the footage landed differently on a large screen in a quiet room than they had on a phone or a television. The first was the audio of Briggs's whisper, which the prosecution's technical team had isolated and amplified, so that the words which Marcus had heard clearly from 6 inches away, but which no camera on the sidewalk had captured, were now audible to everyone in the room. And several jurors wrote something down at exactly the same moment. The second was the image of Marcia's right hand stopping at waist level when Briggs offered the high five, a small movement, half a second of footage, but the jury watched it 3 times when the prosecution played it again in slow motion, and the story it told required no narration. The third was the server room. Stalls's voice on the internal mic make him look like an aggressor. And then the laughter, which in the quiet of that formal room carried a particular weight that it had not quite carried as a headline or a soundbite. When Marcus took the stand, the defense attorney attempted the approach that had been the only available approach from the beginning, that Marcus had been argumentative, non-compliant, that the officer had been doing his job in difficult circumstances with incomplete information. And Marcus waited for the question to finish, and then he said, An order built on an unlawful foundation is not a lawful order. Counselor: Officer Briggs did not stop me because I had committed a crime. He stopped me because he could not reconcile my existence with the set of assumptions he had decided to carry into that neighborhood. My car was not stolen. My identification was not fraudulent. My presence was not suspicious, except to a man who had decided, before he opened the cruiser door, what my presence meant. What I resisted was not the law. It was the violation of it. And if you can't tell the difference between those two things, then the question of who was out of place on that sidewalk has a very clear answer. The defense attorney sat down. Stalls testified against Briggs under the terms of his cooperation agreement, and the moment Briggs understood that his own chief was on the stand dismantling his version of events in exchange for a reduced charge was visible on his face and was captured by every camera in the room. The jury deliberated for 42 minutes, guilty on all counts. When the verdict was read, Marcus closed his eyes for 3 seconds, and then he opened them, and he was already thinking about what came next. The federal sentencing hearing was held 6 weeks later in a smaller room that felt, for that reason, more intimate and more final. The way that smaller rooms always make consequential things feel more real than large ones do, and the judge presiding was the Honorable Diana Alcott, who had built her reputation on a zero-tolerance approach to public corruption that was not political positioning but genuine conviction, and who looked at Cody Briggs over her reading glasses with the specific expression of a person who has heard every available excuse for a particular category of behavior and has decided that exhausting the supply does not change the underlying facts. Briggs had lost weight since the arrest, not dramatically, but enough that his suit, which was not the well-fitted kind, hung on him in a way that made him look less like a man facing consequences and more like a man being slowly vacated by them. And he stood when directed with the careful, effortful posture of someone for whom standing had recently become a thing that required conscious decision. Judge Alcott spoke before the sentence, and what she said was not a speech. It was an accounting delivered in the plain, specific language of someone who did not believe that gravity required ornamentation. What the badge had represented, what Briggs had used it for the names of the people in his complaint file who had not had the voice or the resources to make anyone listen, and the name of the man in the front row who had, and what the difference between those two categories of person revealed about the specific, deep-rooted failure that Briggs represented within his department. Briggs's statement before sentencing lasted 4 minutes and contained the word mistake 7 times, and Judge Alcott let him finish, and then said precisely and without cruelty that a mistake was a single, isolated failure of judgment, and that what the record showed was a pattern of deliberate choices made over years by a man who understood what he was doing and continued doing it because no one with the authority to stop him had chosen to exercise that authority, and that calling that a mistake was itself a choice she declined to validate. The sentence, 9 years in federal custody, no early release eligibility, full forfeiture of pension, with the pension funds directed to a restitution account for the individuals named in his complaint history. The gavel came down with a sound that was not loud, but that carried in the specific silence of that room with the weight of something that had been a long time coming and had finally, at significant cost, arrived. Briggs was turned by the federal marshals toward the exit, and he looked at Marcus, once the briefest, most involuntary glance. And Marcus looked back at him with the same expression he had worn on the hood of the Mustang, perfectly deliberately, still a man who had already decided what this moment was and what it was not, and who was ready to move past it. It was late on a Thursday evening, the kind of quiet that settled into the brownstone after 10 o'clock when the street traffic had thinned and the only sounds were the house settling and the refrigerator doing whatever refrigerators do at that hour. And Marcus and Valerie sat at his desk with the settlement paperwork between them and 2 cups of coffee that had both gone slightly cold. The civil judgment had been significant compensatory damages from the city. punitive damages from Briggs personally, a number that reflected the jury's understanding that the point was not compensation but consequence. And Valerie had known before she asked what her father's answer was going to be, but she asked anyway because it was the kind of question that deserved to be spoken aloud rather than assumed. "Are you keeping any of it?" she said. Marcus looked at the paperwork for a moment, and then he told her about a case he had presided over 8 years earlier. A 24-year-old from the Millbrook neighborhood wrongly charged with aggravated assault, public defender, with a caseload that made adequate preparation structurally impossible, no money for private counsel, no family with the resources or the knowledge to navigate what was happening. And the young man had taken a plea deal for something he had not done, because the alternative was a trial he could not afford and a sentence he could not risk. And Marcus had ruled within the law as it existed in that room, and he had gone home that evening and sat in this exact chair and understood that he had done his job correctly, and the outcome was still wrong, and that those two things could both be true simultaneously, and that the gap between them was where people's lives fell through. "I have thought about that case probably 200 times since then," Marcus said. "I am not going to think about it 201. He signed the paperwork establishing the Web Legal Defense Initiative, a nonprofit dedicated to providing full top-tier legal representation at no cost to individuals who had been subjected to police misconduct and lacked the financial means to pursue accountability through the courts. And Valerie watched him sign it, and she did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "He thought he was ruining your night. He thought he was putting you in your place." Marcus set down the pen. "He was," he said, "just not the place he had in mind." He capped the pen, straightened the paperwork, and reached for his cold coffee, and Valerie laughed. Not because it was particularly funny, but because after everything her father was still her father, and that was the most important thing the last 3 months had confirmed. Movement 1. Stalls. Raymond Stalls was processed into federal custody on a Tuesday morning, and the specific detail that stayed with the officers who handled the intake was not anything he said, but the way he kept reaching involuntarily toward his left chest, the muscle memory of a man who had worn a badge for 26 years, looking for something that was no longer there and finding nothing every time, with an expression that was not dramatic but was somehow worse than dramatic. The expression of a man slowly understanding that the thing he had organized his entire identity around was gone, and that without it he did not know what was left, and that this was going to be a very long time to find out. Movement 2. Marsh. Tyler. Marsh left the Oak Falls Police Department 3 weeks after the trial. Not under any formal pressure, but because he walked into the building one morning, stood in the lobby for about 90 seconds, and understood with complete clarity that whatever he had gone into law enforcement to do this was not the place where it was going to happen. He applied to the Web Legal Defense Initiative the following week and was hired as a case investigator, which was not a prestigious title and did not pay what a police officer's salary paid, and Marsh had not asked about either of those things. He was sitting at his desk on a Wednesday morning 6 months after the trial, working through a stack of case files, when he opened one that made him stop a 22-year-old from Millbrook, wrongly charged with aggravated assault. Public defender, already at capacity family, with no resources and no roadmap. And the officer who had made the initial arrest was from the Oak Falls 4th Precinct, and the precinct rotation showed a name Marsh recognized. Marsh looked at the file for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and dialed the number for the State Attorney General's Civil Rights Division. And when the line connected, he said, "I need to talk to someone about a pattern I've found. I think I have 4 cases. There might be more." He did not hang up for a very long time. Movement 3. Briggs' community service was not what Briggs had imagined when he thought in the abstract way that people think about accountability when they believe it will never apply to them, about what justice for someone like him might look like. He had imagined something more cinematic. He supposed something that matched the scale of what had happened. but the reality was a neon safety vest and a trash spike, and the particular stretch of Garrison Street that ran past Patrice's Fine Bakery on a Thursday afternoon in late October with the specific indignity of an ordinary task on an ordinary street. A car went by a dark blue sedan moving at a reasonable speed, and the driver, a young black man in his early 20s, tapped the horn once because Briggs had drifted close to the road, reaching for a piece of wet paper, and Briggs stepped back, and the anger came fast, familiar already in his chest before he had consciously registered it. And then he looked at the neon vest, and he looked at the trash spike, and he looked at the street around him, and the anger went somewhere. It hadn't gone before. It went quiet. He looked down. He stepped back onto the sidewalk. He picked up the paper. The raspberry tarts at Patrice's Fine Bakery were, in Valerie Webb's considered and frequently stated opinion, the finest thing produced in the state, and this opinion had not changed in 27 years of holding it, and it was not going to change today, which was her 31st birthday, and the first one she had spent in this particular bakery without a specific and complicated set of feelings about the parking spot visible through the window. The Mustang was not in that spot. Marcus had sold it 4 months after the trial to a young man named Deshaun Carter, who had just passed the bar on his second attempt and had $300 in his checking account and a job offer from a public interest law firm that started in 30 days, and Marcus had sold it to him for exactly what Deshaun could afford, which was not much, and had asked in return only that the car be driven and not stored, and Deshaun had agreed. And Marcus had watched it pull away from the curb of the brownstone, feeling something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but was the particular satisfaction of knowing that a thing you loved was going somewhere. It could still be useful. He drove a sensible silver sedan now, which Valerie had described as deeply unlike him, and which he had defended on the grounds that it had excellent safety ratings and a very good sound system, and she had said that was not the point. And he had said he knew. They were at the window table, the one that looked out onto Garrison Street, and Valerie was on her second tart, and Marcus was on his first coffee, and outside, the afternoon light was doing the particular thing it did in October in this part of the city. Amber and low and slightly nostalgic in the way that October always was, and Marcus was looking at the spot on the curb where the Mustang had been parked, which Valerie noticed and did not comment on for a moment. "How does it feel?" she asked. He thought about this genuinely the way he thought about questions that deserved a genuine answer. "Quiet," he said. "The way a room feels after something loud has finally stopped." He watched the street through the window. The ordinary movement of an ordinary afternoon, people going into the bakery and coming out, a woman with a stroller navigating around a man on his phone, a kid on a bicycle making the particular calculation of whether the gap between two parked cars was wide enough to fit through. Near the door of the bakery, a young officer new to the force, his uniform still carrying the crispness of someone who had not yet worn it enough for it to become natural, held the door open for an elderly woman who was leaving with a pink pastry box. And when she thanked him, he said something that made her laugh genuinely and with her whole face, and she touched his arm briefly and went on her way. Marcus watched this. He did not say anything about it because there was nothing to say about it that the moment itself had not already said more clearly. He picked up his fork. Valerie finished the last corner of her tart and looked at the empty plate, and then at the display case near the counter with the professional assessment of someone taking stock of available options. "I'm going to get another one," she said. "And before you say anything, justice doesn't mean I can't have 3 tarts on my birthday." Marcus looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed, the real kind, the full-bodied kind, and it was the best sound in the bakery by some distance. "Go ahead," he said. "You've earned it." The storm had passed. The street was clean. And on this corner of Garrison Street, for this family in this moment, the ordinary had been restored. Not because the world had become fair, but because 2 people had refused to let the unfair parts of it be the last word. If this story moved you, if you saw something in Marcus Webb that reminded you of someone you know or yourself, please take a second and like this video, because it genuinely helps more stories like this one reach people who need to hear them. Share it with someone who believes that dignity is worth fighting for. And if you haven't already subscribed to our channel, we have a lot more stories where this one came from, and every single one of them is about the same thing, the truth eventually catching up. We'll see you in the next one.